All right, y'all, here we go. We're about to learn. We're about to learn about pharmacology. Medications have four basic sources: plant, animal, mineral, and synthetic. Plants are the oldest source of medications, many of which are still used today. Atropine, a medication that blocks the parasympathetic nervous system, is an extract of the belladonna plant. Morphine, a very potent painkiller, is a product of the opium poppy. Digitalis is produced from the purple foxglove plant. One very common EMS medication, 50% dextrose, is made from sugarcane. Nearly all animal sources of medications have been replaced by synthetic sources. Historically, animals have provided many different hormones, such as oxytocin and insulin, that were a close enough match to human hormones to have the same effect on the body. Today, animal sources include many different vaccines that are produced using chicken eggs for incubation. Salts and other inorganic materials are a common source of medications, especially those used to treat mineral deficits in the body. Sodium bicarbonate is an example of a medication that is produced from a mineral source. Others include calcium chloride, saline, sodium chloride, solutions, and potassium chloride. With the advances in recombinant DNA technology over the last 2 decades, many of the medications that were once derived from animal or plant sources are now created in the laboratory with recombinant DNA technology. Recombinant DNA medications include humulin, human insulin, and tissue plasminogen activator, TPA, a fibrinolytic, a substance that breaks down blood clots. Other medications are designed by pharmaceutical researchers to meet a specific need. Lidocaine, an antidysrhythmic and local anesthetic, and diazepam, a benzodiazepine sedative hypnotic drug, are examples of synthetic drugs developed in a laboratory to achieve specific effects within the body. Before administering any drug, you must know the basic information about it. What is known about drugs and their effects changes, so you must keep current by reviewing new information regularly. There are many different printed and electronic sources of medication reference material. Be familiar with reliable and up-to-date sources that are available to you and use them when necessary. Medication doses may be slightly different from source to source. Many sources list a range of dosages, but your protocols usually give a specific dosage within that range. For example, a reference guide may list the dose of epinephrine for anaphylaxis as 0.3 to 0.5 milligrams of a 1 to 1,000 solution, to be given subcutaneously or intramuscularly. Your protocol might specifically state that you should administer 0.3 subcutaneously. You must follow your protocol and administer the 0.3 of medication as directed. A medication profile describes the key information needed in order to administer a medication safely. A typical medication profile includes the following information: medication name, which is the medication name, includes the generic name, trade name, and chemical name of the medication. The classification, which is the classification of a medicine, is the type of medication it is. A number of different classification schemes are used. Drugs may be classified by their mechanism of action or by the body system on which they are intended to act. As an example, nitroglycerin USP is a vasodilator, but it can also be classified as a cardiovascular medication. USP just means US Pharm. Mechanism of action. The mechanism of action is the way in which a medication achieves its intended effects. For example, epinephrine stimulates alpha-1, beta-1, and beta-2 cellular receptors in the sympathetic nervous system. It causes an increase in cardiocontractile force, speed of cardiac electrical conduction, and rate of cardiac contraction. It causes dilation of the bronchiolar smooth muscles, but causes constriction of the peripheral vascular smooth muscle. Indications. The indications are the conditions that the medication is intended to treat. For example, 50% dextrose is intended for hypoglycemia. Your protocols may define a specific glucometer reading as an indication for the drug. Pharmacokinetics. They describe how a drug is absorbed, distributed to the tissues, and eliminated from the body. Side effects are unintended effects of the medication. For example, one side effect of nitroglycerin administration is headache. An untoward effect is a side effect with a negative impact on the body, such as hypotension. Route of administration. The route of administration is the way in which a medication is introduced into the body. Many medications have more than one route of administration. For example, nitroglycerin may be given by sublingual or transdermal routes, depending upon the form prescribed. Contraindications. Contraindications are conditions that make administration of the drug harmful, even though it is otherwise indicated for the patient's medical problem. Dose. The dose is the amount of medication to be administered and the frequency with which it should be administered. For example, 0.4 milligrams nitroglycerin could be administered sublingually every 3 to 5 minutes, up to a total of 3 doses. How supplied. This portion of the profile describes the forms of packaging and concentrations that are available. For example, epinephrine is packaged as 1 milligrams in 1 milliliter, 1 to 1,000 concentration, and as 1 milligrams in 10 milliliters, 1 to 10,000 concentration. Each concentration is supplied for different routes of administration and indications. The 1 to 1,000 concentration is administered intramuscularly and subcutaneously, and the 1 to 10,000 concentration is administered intravenously. Special considerations. This section of the medication profile describes any changes in dosage, administration, or other aspects of the medication for pediatric, geriatric, or pregnant patients, or patients with particular medical conditions, such as renal failure. It also describes any special precautions to be observed when administering the drug to special patient populations. Pharmaceutical manufacturers in the United States must adhere to many laws and regulations that are in place to protect the consumer from harm. Think of a medication commercial that you have seen on television. Do you recall the narrator listing the potential side effects of the medication? The manufacturer is required to provide the public with information in all marketing of the medication so that the consumer can make an informed decision about using it. Additionally, manufacturers are required to follow strict standards to ensure that medication produced by different manufacturers are the same strength and are safe for use. Further information on U.S. drug regulations can be accessed through the National Formulary and the United States Pharmacopoeia. Legislation. Medical legislation is intended to protect the public from unsafe and mislabeled medications. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 was enacted to ensure proper medication labeling. The Harrison Narcotic Act of 1914 placed regulations on the importation, manufacture, sale, and use of medications, including the addictive drugs opium and cocaine, and requires penalties up to and including imprisonment for violations. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938 was enacted to provide additional protection to the public. Revised in 1952 and 1962, it provides the following more comprehensive regulations. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938, 52, and 62 authorized the formation of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, mandated that addictive and harmful medications are dispensed with a prescription by a medical doctor, dentist, or veterinarian. Required manufacturers to label their medications when they include addictive drugs and to list potential side effects of the medication. In 1951, the Durham-Humphrey Amendments were added to the 1938 Act. Those amendments required pharmacists to dispense certain medications only with a written or verbal prescription by a physician. The amendments also defined the over-the-counter medication category. The Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970, known as the Controlled Substance Act, replaced the Harrison Narcotic Act of 1914. To further protect the public, 5 schedules of controlled substances were created, with each having its own regulation regarding level of control. Drugs are assigned to the schedule based on their potential for abuse. Schedule 1 drugs have the greatest potential for abuse, and Schedule 5 drugs have the least potential for abuse. Controlled substances used in the pre-hospital environment include morphine and fentanyl for pain relief, and benzodiazepines such as midazolam and diazepam for seizures. Although they are not controlled substances, most of the other medications used in EMS have been identified as dangerous enough to require a prescription. When you administer a medication to a patient according to protocol, you are doing so under direct order by your medical director, which means the medication is being prescribed to the patient by the medical director. Even though the physician is prescribing the medication, he is doing so based on your assessment of the patient. It is your responsibility to perform a thorough assessment to identify the need for proper medication administration. Schedule 1 medications have a high potential for abuse and do not have any recognized medical use in the United States. The examples are heroin, LSD, mescaline, and methaqualone. Methaqualone. Is that Quaaludes? I don't know. So, Schedule 2 medications have a high potential for abuse but also have a recognized medical use in the U.S. These medications require a written prescription and are restricted from phone renewals and require oversight by a physician. Abuse may result in severe physical or psychological dependence. Examples: morphine, codeine, meperidine, hydrocodone, and a host of very addictive stimulants and depressants. Schedule 3 medications have less abuse potential than Schedule 2 and an accepted medical use. Abuse can result in moderate to low physical or psychological dependence. Examples: anabolic steroids, non-prescription painkillers combined with small amounts of Schedule 2 substances such as acetaminophen with codeine or hydrocodone. Also, medications that contain small amounts of opiates. Schedule 4 medications have less abuse potential than Schedule 3 and an accepted medical use. Abuse can result in less physical or psychological dependence than drugs in Schedule 3. Examples are benzodiazepines, some barbiturates, steroids, and stimulants. Schedule 5 medications have less than 4 and accepted medical use. Abuse can result in less Examples are over-the-counter medications for cough or antidiarrheal medications that contain small amounts of controlled substances. Over-the-counter medications are medications that present a low risk to the user as long as the medication is used as directed on the label. Because the risk is low, over-the-counter medications can be purchased without a prescription at pharmacies and other retailers. Regulations outlining the proper storage, tracking, and distribution of medications in the pre-hospital setting can vary from state to state. You must be familiar with the regulations of your state and employer. Before 1938, medication testing was not always required. In fact, before the creation of the FDA, there was little or no oversight over what could be sold to the public as a medication. Today, developing a new medication is a very stringent and controlled process that takes years to accomplish. The FDA is responsible for the testing of each new medication offered for sale in the United States and for continuing to collect data about its safety after it is on the market. The FDA is also responsible for food safety, the testing of new medical devices, and cosmetic safety in the United States. To obtain FDA approval for a medication, manufacturers must participate in a rigorous and very expensive process. In the initial phases of this process, a new medication must be proven safe using animal and laboratory testing over several generations of test animals. During this time, researchers determine the safe dose and how the medication enters and leaves the body. If the medication is proven safe to administer after several cycles of lab testing, it can enter clinical trials for evaluation in humans. The clinical trial process is tightly controlled and can take years to complete. In Phase 1 testing, researchers attempt to determine the safe dose and how the medication is both absorbed and eliminated from the body. This is usually conducted on a limited number of healthy volunteers. Phase 2 consists of the drug being tested on a small number, usually 300 or less, people with the illness or condition that the drug is designed to treat. In this phase, researchers attempt to determine the needed level of drug to obtain the desired effect without causing undesirable side effects. In Phase 3, the trial is expanded to include a large sample size, usually in the thousands of individuals, and establish the overall safety and effectiveness of the drug. Risk versus benefit for using the medication is determined during this phase. At the conclusion of Phase 3, the FDA may approve marketing the medication for sale. Phase 4 trials compare the medication to other medications on the market. Because there are strict guidelines regarding testing drugs on pediatric and pregnant patients, the safety of drugs in those groups often has not been established. Medications can affect patients differently. Some special considerations to be kept in mind include those for patients who are pregnant, patients who are infants or children, and patients who are elderly. Prior to administering a medication to a woman of childbearing age, consider the possibility of her being pregnant. Ask her about it during your assessment. If she is pregnant, you will be treating 2 patients. This is particularly true when administering medications because some will affect the fetus by crossing the placental barrier. Even some over-the-counter medications pose a risk to a developing fetus and should be avoided by the mother. Before administering a medication, you must consider the risk versus benefit to the patient. If the patient's condition is life-threatening, you must treat her. In these situations and when it is unclear about how you should proceed, contact medical directions for instructions. When treating a pregnant patient, consider the following: changes in anatomy and physiology. To support the fetus, the mother's heart rate, cardiac output, and blood volume increase. Additionally, metabolism in the liver is decreased. Those alterations can affect the onset, duration of action, and rate of elimination of medication. I must check to make sure I'm still on the camera. Risk to the fetus. Teratogenic medications are those that potentially can deform, injure, or kill the fetus. To provide direction to healthcare providers, the FDA created FDA pregnancy categories for medications. Drugs are also rated for their safety during breastfeeding. That is slightly outdated. I think they're phasing that out, but you can still look up the FDA pregnancy class for most medications. In addition to the obvious physical differences between the adult and the pediatric patient, there are also differences in how medications affect children. Pediatric drug dosing is usually based on the patient's weight, amount per kilogram. So the dosage varies from patient to patient, even between patients of the same age. Because it takes infants longer to absorb, metabolize, and eliminate medications than it does adults, doses must be adjusted accordingly to the patient's body weight to prevent toxicity. Older children can absorb and metabolize some medications faster than an adult. Therefore, they also require adjustments in dose and frequency of administration. The FDA pregnancy categories are as follows. A. Studies have not identified a risk to the fetus during pregnancy. Category B, animal studies have not identified a risk to the fetus, but there are no adequate human studies, or adequate studies in humans have not demonstrated a risk to the fetus during pregnancy, but animal studies have produced adverse effects. C, animal studies have demonstrated adverse effects, but there are no adequate studies in pregnant women. However, benefits may be acceptable despite potential risks, or no adequate animal studies or adequate studies of pregnant women have been performed. Category D, studies have shown risk to the fetus. In some situations, benefits can outweigh the risks. X, studies have shown risk to the fetus. This risk outweighs any potential benefit to the mother. Avoid using these medications in pregnant or potentially pregnant patients. The effects of a medication in geriatric patients are often different from that of a younger adult. As people age, a steady decrease of muscle mass, renal and hepatic function, and oral absorption rates occur. Each of those factors affects important processes including the absorption, distribution, metabolism, and elimination of a medication. Geriatric patients are prone to medication interactions for many reasons, including changes in physiology, taking multiple drugs, and memory impairment. You must be able to recognize when a patient requires the administration of a medication to treat his or her condition. However, it is just as important to know when not to administer a medication. It is your responsibility to remain knowledgeable about the medications you give. Geriatric patients may have multiple medical conditions that require the use of multiple medications. When some medications are used together, they can produce life-threatening conditions. For example, administering nitroglycerin to a patient who has taken an erectile dysfunction medication, such as Cialis or Viagra, may cause severe hypotension. During your assessment, identify which medication the patient is taking and avoid administering medications that will interact with the others and result in an adverse effect. Most medications have four names: trade name, chemical name, generic name, and the official name. Each describes the medication in a different way and for a different purpose. Manufacturers create a proprietary or trade name for a medication under which they can trademark and market the drug. For example, the medication Preventil is the trade name for albuterol, the generic name, of a popular medication used to treat asthma. Trade names are capitalized and, in drug packaging and marketing, are followed by either the trademark symbol or the registered symbol. Often, the trade name of a new medication is the one that most people recognize because those drugs are heavily marketed to the public. The same drug may be marketed under different names, trade names, by different companies. Once a pharmaceutical company's patent on a drug expires, it is often sold primarily under its generic name. The chemical name is a precise description of the chemical composition and molecular structure of the medication. Usually it is a complex formula and most likely only recognizable and usable by a pharmacist. A common example is acetylsalicylic acid, the chemical name for aspirin. The official and generic names for a medication are often identical and are often very familiar to the public. In many cases, the medication is referred to only by the generic name because of the long-established use of the medication. For example, the generic and official medication names albuterol sulfate and albuterol sulfate USP are usually more familiar to the people as their trade name Preventil. The official name of a medication is assigned by the USP and can be identified by the letters USP that appear after the name. The following is an example of how each name is published. Trade name, Preventil. Chemical name, alpha-1 terbutalimab. Generic name, albuterol sulfate. Official name, albuterol sulfate USP. How long we've been going? 20 minutes. 20 minutes.